Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Whitlam Institute seminar on the arts and democracy. Before we get into the substance of today, and in these very strange times we find ourselves in, it's still really important, I think, that we all acknowledge the countries we're meeting on from our respective Zoom cameras and the nations they represent. So let me start off by saying that I'm sitting here on the land of the Gadigal and the Wongal nations, and I pay my respects to their ancestors who have been in this space for tens of thousands of years. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to offer a very special welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us for this conversation today. This is the first time the Whitlam Institute has done an online webinar. We think we have worked it out, and we hope everything will run smoothly, but we would ask for your patience should we run into any technical problems, and we have a fantastic team from the Institute who will be doing their very best to make sure it goes as smoothly as possible. There are a couple of things at the outset, though, that I should let you know about in terms of how we'll run the session. So I'm going to give a bit of an introduction now, and then we're going to give about 10 minutes to each of our fantastic panellists to address some big questions around the value of the arts. Then I'm going to do one round of follow-on questions with each of our panellists, and then open up to those of you who've joined us as participants to see what questions and comments you might like to share with the panel. We will be recording this Zoom conversation. So I wanted to just be very clear with you that what we're recording are the panellists' interventions. If you're joining us as an attendee, your presence won't be recorded at all. If you do submit a question or a comment in the Q&A, we will be collecting those comments and using them hopefully to develop some kind of discussion paper, because as usual with these kind of webinars, we may not get to every question, and we want to make sure that your contributions are reflected and recorded in the follow-up that we do. So that's kind of on the technical side of things, and assuming that all of our participants have been able to get onto the Zoom now, we might get into the meat of this webinar. So let me start off by telling you a little bit about where we're coming from and why we're doing this today. So at the Whitlam Institute, we are striving every day to deliver distinctive, bold and inspiring policy research and programs that promote common ground, inclusive national identity and civic engagement for all Australians. So we're aiming to focus on issues of concern across the political spectrum, despite where our roots come from, and to deliver a nation-building agenda that will, as Gough charged us, help the great and continuing work of building a more equal, open, tolerant and independent Australia. Many of you will be aware that the Whitlam government operated under three great aims. Just to remind you what they were, those aims were firstly to promote equality, secondly to involve the people of Australia in the decision-making of the country, and thirdly, and perhaps most importantly for the conversation we're going to have today, to liberate the talents and uplift the horizons of the Australian people. So what we do at the Whitlam Institute these days is we do policy research under two particular themes. Those themes are the future of Australian democracy, and secondly, Australia in the world. So I think the topic of our conversation today, the arts and democracy, fits pretty well within both of those themes. So as part of that policy research, we started doing some things last year that led us to where we are today for this conversation. The first is we hosted an exhibition in 2019 called Whitlam, the Arts and Democracy. And the exhibition was titled Dedicated to the Dedicated. And that was a reference to a beautiful folio of artworks that were gifted to Gough and Margaret Whitlam in 1979 because of their contribution to the arts. So we built a wonderful exhibition around that folio of artworks, bringing in all of the policy changes that happened during the Whitlam government to try and remind us of the contemporary relevance of those policy initiatives today. The second thing we did after we launched this body of work with the exhibition was to ask Kim Williams AM to author a Whitlam legacy paper for us. And Kim did draft that paper. It's called Whitlam, the Arts and Democracy. and it examines the impact of Whitlam-era arts and culture policies on Australian culture, our institutions, and our identity. From our perspective, there's no one better placed to offer that analysis than he. And at the Institute, we're indebted to him for the time and the energy he invested in this paper, which I think you can find on the events page where you would have signed in to our webinar today. And it's also available on the website. I thought it might be worthwhile just drawing out a little bit of Kim's paper to inform our conversation today, because there's a lot of great work in there. To quote from his paper, Kim said, "Never in Australian history had cultural policy enjoyed centre stage as a deep political commitment until that precious moment in Blacktown, New South Wales, on a hot November night in 1972. Never had matters of art and culture been central to the national future and its agenda allied with such issues as the economy, health, welfare, and human rights." Kim's research also illustrated how Whitlam empowered and involved artists in the expansion of key cultural institutions. Again, he says, "Above all, Whitlam's policy approach was grounded in a firm conviction that artists themselves must oversee the policy and priorities in resource allocation to programs and should determine the funding that was to be provided. It was a wholly renovated approach to public policy development and determination. It was a policy commitment which was firmly rooted in respect for the artist and celebration of creative life as a worthy vocation." Imagine that today. Kim maps out in his paper how many threshold decisions were taken that led to, for example, the establishment of the National Gallery of Australia, that created a new beginning for the Australia Council for the Arts. It reformed Australian radio, including the establishment of Double J, which was later to become Triple J. Establishing the public lending right, Australian content quotas, removing censorship in favour of classifications, the Australian Film Commission, and, for example, the Aboriginal Arts Board, where every single member of that board was an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. A key theme that was resonating through Kim's paper about Whitlam was his singular purpose was about the expansion of resources for the arts, because he believed that access to the arts was a fundamental human right and a precondition for a healthy democracy. So that's the framing that I wanted to share with you about Kim's paper, and I really do recommend it to you to have a look at if you're interested in where we've come from and why those policy reforms might be things that we might want to consider in how we move forward today. But today's conversation is really about us making one small effort to facilitate a national conversation on the importance of arts and culture to a vibrant and healthy democracy. I understand that the New York Times is just starting to do a similar thing this week, and they kicked off today with Sonny Rollins talking about why the arts matters to society. And I saw that over the next couple of weeks, the New York Times will be including a whole range of other fantastic people, including Kate Blanchett, talking about similar things. Our goal today really is to better understand why the inherent value of arts and culture is underappreciated in our society and our culture, and to discuss how we might be able to change the narrative to get Australians and Australian governments to have more of a sense of connection to and provide more support for the arts. Now, of course, how we do that in the context of COVID-19, which has really revealed the pre-existing fragility of Australia's artistic community and support for it, is indeed going to be the challenge for us in the conversation. I am now just going to move to introducing our panel, but I also wanted to recommend to you and thank a couple of individuals who've helped us prepare some fantastic interviews on video for the conversation today. You can find those also on the events page and our web page. So a huge thank you to Kate Champion, Ivor Indyke and Liz Jones for those video interviews that really add a lot of depth to the conversation we're about to have today. But today, as you all know, we are very lucky to have with us a fantastic range of people. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about them in case you're not familiar with them already. excuse me while I search for my tools here. All right, there I am. We're going to start today with Thomas Keneally AO, who's going to give us a broader sense of this issue of arts and culture over time in Australia. Thomas Keneally is one of Australia's most popular and prolific writers, having published more than 30 novels, dramas, screenplays, and books of non-fiction. He's also one of Australia's most distinguished. He has twice received the Miles Franklin Award and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize 3 times before winning for Schindler's Ark, later made into the Academy Award-winning film Schindler's List. His novel, The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, is of course an Australian classic. And Tom published a piece in the Sydney Morning Herald over the weekend titled Why the Government Must Act to Save the Arts Before It's Too Late. Our next speaker will be Professor Julian Meyrick. Julian is Professor of Creative Arts at the Centre for Creative Arts Industries at Griffith University, and he's joining us from Melbourne today. He was previously Strategic Professor of Creative Arts at Flinders University, and he is the Artistic Council for the State Theatre Company of South Australia, and a member of both the Currency House Editorial and the CHAS boards. He has a long history of involvement himself personally in the arts, aside from his academic career. Julian published a piece recently for The Conversation titled Artists Shouldn't Have to Endlessly Demonstrate Their Value. Coalition Leaders Used to Know It. Our next speaker will be Dr. Josephine Caust. Josephine is Associate Professor and Honorary Principal Fellow at the University of Melbourne, and she has a focus on cultural leadership, cultural policy, and cultural rights. She's published several books, including Arts Leadership in Contemporary Contexts, Arts and Cultural Leadership in Asia. She was a founding editor of the Asia Pacific Journal of Arts and Cultural Management, and she's the author of many journal articles. Jo recently published a piece also for The Conversation titled Coronavirus, 3 in 4 Australians employed in the creative arts performing arts could lose their jobs. And our 4th speaker today will be Abdullah. Abdul is a multimedia artist working across painting, photography, video and performance to connect with diverse communities in Australia. He's originally from Perth, but is joining us from Sydney today. And he's a self-described outsider amongst outsiders. His practice is primarily concerned with the experience of the other in society. And he's engaged with different marginalised minority groups across Australia. He's particularly interested in the experience of young Muslims in the contemporary multicultural Australian context. His work is represented all over Australia and internationally in both the United States, Asia and Europe. So a huge welcome to all of our panellists as we go forward now into the conversation. So the first question I wanted to start with for each of you is quite a big one, but I think we're so focused on the intricacies of what's happening right now in the middle of this crisis that it's sometimes helpful to step back a bit. So I wanted to ask each of you, from your own perspective and experiences, throughout history and across the globe, how have the arts and culture contributed to societies around the world over time? And secondly, how have arts and culture contributed to social awareness, political discourse, and debate? So Tom, would you like to kick us off with your first 10-minute intervention around those broad questions?
Certainly, thank you. And I was just thinking, you know how if you get a writer on, he will try to sell his new book. My new book is about Dickens sending 2 sons to Australia, exporting his own failed literature. But the point that faced Gough Whitlam was to inbuild an Australian literature at a time when the concept was not particularly popular, but in a period when the time for that idea to come right, as for the Australian graphic arts, as for Australian performers as well, that these endeavours should be installed in society. But the problem with the arts is that they give a value to society which is imponderable. And in trying to defend them, it's like trying to explain why we first made the mark of a buffalo or of human hands on some Paleolithic wall in Europe. We can't say why. It is partly to advertise our presence, A, to the gods, and B, to other tribes. But what is the value of that? It's very hard to put a dollar value on the imponderable. This has often happened in Australian history when there was, when Jabiru and other explorations were getting going in the Northern Territory. There is an arcade of 35,000-year-old art up there. And Hawke set a committee to work out its value to the community, its value in terms of heritage. And they came up with the unhelpful idea that the value of this 35,000-year-old art site was infinite. And this is the problem of the arts, that their value can be reduced to economic formulae, but their impact to those who are touched by their influence is imponderable and therefore infinite. And this is why we think, I think we've always had the trouble that Professor Meyrick had, the problem of why do we have to go on defending our existence to the economists, to society in general, even to those who have benefited. Donald Horne said never descend to arguing about the arts in purely economic form, because you will always end up playing the game on their paddock. You will never play a home game. I think there's some truth to that, but I think at a time like this, to come down to a time of the coronavirus, where some jobs have been targeted and others have been left out, we have to descend to the economic, at least in part. One of the reasons for creating an arts industry, and important to Whitlam, was the impact it would have on our democracy and our discourse. I hope that it would refine our discourse, and I think the arts have in ways that I could point to, and to let other tribes know that we're here. And we did do both those things. I remember the first excitement of so doing, both the letting other tribes know of our presence and the excitement of identifying our own tribe to ourselves. The Whitlam idea was partly one of a benign Australian inroad on the world's consciousness, but also on our own. And no one thought we had the quality to do it. I'm sorry for these noises of emails coming in from other parts of Australia. The Whitlam idea was so valuable to us. He put a vote of confidence in what we were doing when we weren't confident ourselves, when we're still full of cultural insecurity and self-doubt. One of the ways he did that was by connecting the arts to communications. The ABC, there is an imponderable and unutterable value to Australian TV production, and also a similar, as well as an economic ledger to the film arts. There is a similarly imponderable that he seemed to think was worth money in itself, so that the arts were there with the miners, and the arts were there with the brewers, with Fosters. The arts were part of a general inroad into the world and into our own inner space. We were bold enough to think of our own big films. This was part of growing up. This was part of the post-colonial assault on our own imaginations and on the imagination of the world. So it was far bigger equation than the ornamental sense that so many politicians now give to the arts. The arts are meant to be ornamental. They're meant to adorn an evening. The other problem in helping the arts is the gulf between the accomplished, or those who there is some consensus about them being accomplished, and the fertilization, supporting excellence and encouraging excellence. I think to Goff, encouraging excellence to emerge from people who were children when he brought his arts policy into being, that would always be the primary issue, issue of making excellence a norm within a society. And again, it's very hard to put a dollar amount on that. And it's interesting that the arts don't have to do that. No one ever asks you to put an economic value on the excellence of a great wicket keeper like Bacchus Marsh. Or who's my favorite, Judy? The great wicket keeper from Lismore? God, I've forgotten. This is old age indeed. The sports are never asked to do so. The arts are regularly asked to do so. And then we have the growth of neoconservative economics, which was less tolerant of pump priming for some imponderable and definite payoff in the future. The neoconservative economics of our times is less tolerant. It frequently strikes out research, let alone the arts. It frequently strikes out longer term research, let alone the arts. And Whitlam was obviously a Keynesian, and for him, the initiation of excellence was the better part of the arts. But for a neoconservative like George Brandis, the fostering of excellence for what it is for what it's already achieved was the answer. And you remember that he assumed part of the arts budget to himself, a very un-Whitlam-esque idea, taking it away from the peer groups so he could foster excellence in centers that were based on George Brandis's idea of excellence. I don't know how those ministerial centers of excellence, from which more than 100 million were, 111.4 million, I believe, were taken by George Brandis. I've heard nothing of them. I hear only of the people who are struggling now. I saw the practical effect. Whitlam said to me once, I knew Maestro. Calling an Australian Maestro in those days was a pretty daring thing to do. I remember, I know Maestro, that if I gave you jokers a few dollars, I'd get it all back in tax. Within a year or so, I saw in a grove of palms at Bilgola Beach, when I then lived, the film being produced of The Year of Living Dangerously. The Year of Living Dangerously broke the news to us of a big slaughter in of supposed communists in Indonesia at a crucial time. Suharto, the Sukarno, the break between Sukarno and Suharto. We had barely noticed it. And Caust imagined it for us, and it's a very important novel for that reason. Caust was a journalist there at the time.
That's a really great example. I'll ask you to start wrapping up now, if you don't mind.
Yes, so one can go over the extent to which the arts contribute to the economy, but the neoconservatives are never satisfied with that. And that, I think, is why, and because there's a suspicion that all artists are pinkos, maybe, that's why the arts, which could have been included in Job Seeker, have now been cut as superfluous to Australian society under the new system. And we can argue during this afternoon, in the tradition of Whitlam, why that concept is alien to the Whitlam equation from which we've all benefited in the last 40, 50 years.
Thank you very much, Tom. Julian, would you like to give us your feedback on these questions next?
Yeah, well, I'll give it a go. I think if there's one thing harder than talking about the arts in a general way, it's talking about them in a general way in your bedroom. It really does make me feel a bit like a prat, but I thought I would sort of give my remarks in a broad-based way, given that the question itself was quite broad. So I think nothing attracts motherhood statements like the arts, except perhaps motherhood itself. And no one is against the arts per se, or argues that they haven't contributed to the development of society. But I think perhaps for that very reason, we can be lazy in looking at just how they make their contribution. So I appreciate what Tom was saying about how hard some things are to talk about in arts and culture, but I think there are others that can be articulated. And I think there are three main benefit areas that get overlooked. Firstly, the unique skills and values that we call the arts, and they're as different from each other as the sciences are, of course, contribute hard ideas and arguments that make up a substantial part of our intellectual life. And by hard, I mean hard-nosed. And this is obvious if you have even a passing acquaintance with any art form. And the distinction that modern Western nations like Australia draw between education and training on the one hand, and artistic creation and culture on the other, is not borne out by either history or observation. It's a spurious division, and there is no line between the two in reality. So just a couple of easy examples. The best description of the theory of Tudor kingship can be found in Shakespeare's history plays, particularly Richard II. And Yellow Pain's rap hit song, My Vote Don't Count, which came out, I think, a couple of months ago, includes a detailed discussion of the American voting system embedded in its lyrics. I actually played it for my students. It's a fantastic explanation of the complete separation of powers. So the justification for the public role of arts and culture that's been made for hundreds of years is that they both entertain and instruct. And it's only very recently that they have been reduced to a matter of personal taste, that the view has spread that it's possible to have an educated society without having a cultured one. But it's a view with no basis in fact. The arts don't just passively reflect the ideas that other areas of our lives come up with. They come up with ideas of their own, and pretending they're a matter of purely subjective preference misrepresents the real intellectual work that they do. And that's the first point. Secondly, the arts supply common experiences, objects of collective response and appreciation. They're fun and things that we can all enjoy. A great thing about the arts, and one of the most important aspects, we don't have to agree about them. In fact, disagreeing about them is one of the most meaningful things we can do in a fully cultural life. That disagreement shouldn't and doesn't stop us being able to draw deeply on the books, paintings, films, music, and media in our world, and using these experiences to populate our common humanity. And I think at a time when political opinion is fragmenting and tearing some communities apart, the collective experiences that the arts provide become even more vital as the bridges over which we can walk to talk to each other in authentic ways once again. And I was just thinking about the question that you can ask somebody, particularly somebody that you don't know very well, you know, what have you been reading or listening to or looking at? And how that is so much more than a simple request for information. But it's the beginning of a kind of mutual understanding or a kind of intimacy. Thirdly, the arts are a home for ideas that are yet to come, or that we can't quite deal with, or are scary or beyond us in some way, and yet which are too important to let go of. And and a lot of threshold art falls into this category, and I'm sure Abdul would have quite a lot to say about this. It's the kind of art that makes people uncomfortable and sometimes profoundly so. And it's as simple and as difficult as the fact that art can lay hold of things that are ineffable, that slip through the cracks of our conscious mind, or are fundamentally embarrassing or wildly challenging or socially forbidden. So they provide a space for experiment and play, for forms and messages that can't easily be raised and discussed in other domains, if at all. So sociologists actually have a term for this. They call it functional redundancy, where the use of the arts is that they have no use, or at least no immediate use, because what they offer are answers to questions that we haven't found the courage, the imagination, or the need yet to ask. So if you put those contributions together, the intellectual, the experiential, and the experimental, you get a picture of a deep dimension of our lives that enables us to think, connect, and imagine in different and unlooked for ways, and in ways other things can't substitute for. So sometimes the arts are directly political, and sometimes they even lead political debate. So a few quick examples, and then a longer one from Australia. I didn't realize until recently that China's Cultural Revolution was triggered by a play, the dismissal of Hai Rui from office, that criticized Mao for the failure of the Great Leap Forward. I did know that another play, The Marriage of Figaro, was a focal point for articulating discontent during the French Revolution. And the 1984 film The Killing Fields, it's a bit like Tom's example of A Year of Living Dangerously, by director Roland Joffé, provided a template for the Ukrainian Orange Revolution. So between 1985 and 1996, that film was seen by nearly every school child in the Ukraine, and it was later taken by activists as a political parable for the importance of avoiding civil war during the country's regime change in the early 2000s. So my longer Australian example, and Tom will know this one very well, is the struggle against censorship in Australia that raged from the early 1960s until Gough Whitlam's election in 1972, and which I don't think would have been successful, or at least so complete, without the involvement of those in the arts who effectively led it. And in my own art form, the theatre, there are countless examples of plays and productions that aim to strike a blow for freedom of speech. And it's only in retrospect that this is a struggle that looks like it was destined to succeed. I think at the time it felt very different. Plays like the musical Hair, The Boys in the Band, America Hurrah, Whatever Happened to Realism, and Norman Ahmed all ended up in court or suppressed or threatened with legal action. And it was a deadly fight fueled by artists who quite deliberately and self-consciously and collectively decided that they wouldn't back down. And they didn't. And as a result, they won a significant political victory, not just for themselves, but for all Australians. So I think one of the reasons that we have such trouble acknowledging the full contribution that the arts make to our lives and paying them the full respect that they deserve is that we live in a society that collapses the idea of knowledge and understanding into the concept of information. And what we forget is that the human mind needs to take things in on a human level. I actually asked my 16-year-old son this question, and this is the answer he gave me, and I think it's absolutely right. What we forget is we're swamped by information, by endless TED Talks, self-help videos and instructions on doing this or that. But how this information relates to us in human terms, how it affects us as human beings in our hearts and souls, seems to be a question we consider only rarely. And so I think we're constantly surprised when people don't react in ways that aren't logical responses to the information provided. We think they're stupid or being deliberately difficult, when in fact we're leaving out consideration of the human dimension of communication, which is the real and chief domain of the arts. And as a final point, I'd note that this problem, what Kim Williams in his Whitlam address, which is amazingly detailed, it's a beautiful piece of work, called The Unwavering March of General Ignorance, is only destined to get worse. So the more information that we produce as a society, the more data, including economic data, the more we face the challenge of integrating it into human understanding so that it doesn't overwhelm us or end up being used to manipulate us, but assumes a shape where it can serve us in meaningful ways. And that's what the arts do. That's their chief value, as extensions of our own humanity in a rapidly complexifying, polarized and crisis-racked world. That's it.
Thank you, Julian. That was really wonderful. I think there's a lot in there for us to discuss when we get to the Q&A. Joe, I think we had you listed next to talk a bit more about your approach to the value of the arts in terms of cultural rights and human rights broadly, but please take the floor.
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you very much for inviting me today. I want to start this in a different way slightly because I want to talk about rights and cultural rights in particular. When I started my working life, I started as an actress, and when I started that work, most of the time when I was employed, there may only be about 2 or 3 females in the company, and there could be up to 20 men. So the gender difference was quite profound. And in fact, the year after the International Year of Women in 1975, I applied to work with a company, and I was told rather proudly actually by the artistic director that he wasn't going to be employing any women that season because all the plays he was intending to do were all male plays and only men would be employed. So that was rather a salutary experience, and I think it was one of those things that also makes you think very hard about how power works in the arts. Gender discrimination, of course, is a reality for all women in all parts of society, and the arts are no exception to that. Despite the fact that the overwhelming number of participants and consumers are generally female, much of the leadership still resides with men. And in 2017, I did a small survey to see what the ratio of leadership was of our major performing arts organisations. And at the time, 90% of the leadership was male. These are the organisations who receive most of the arts funding from both federal and state governments. So in other words, the skewing there in terms of who gets what is quite significant. And therefore, it's fascinating that even at this time, women are not at the decision-making table that makes some of the most important decisions. I wanted to start talking about gender because gender is part of cultural rights, and I'm very passionate about the need for us to recognise cultural rights in any conversation about the arts. The idealised Australian culture is often represented in a way that describes us with particular tropes of the great outdoors, the sun-bronzed surfer, our addiction to sport, and so on, the idea of mateship and the idea of a fair go. But those tropes don't refer to people they're very particular, and they exclude people by gender, by class, by location, and also by ethnicity. So the notion of mateship is, of course, immediately defined by gender, and the notion of a fair go only applies to some people, not all of us. It certainly doesn't apply to Indigenous Australians, recent immigrants, or, for that matter, most women. So I think a democratic society, and this is what we're talking about today, should embrace us all. It should give us a say in what we want to do and what we want to see practiced. We know that Australia is a very complicated and interesting and diverse mixture of genders, identities, cultures, sexual preferences, ages, locations, and so on. We're a nation of many cultures, not just one culture. So it's important to ask, does the current framing of arts and culture in this country reflect the pluralism that actually exists? I think the reality is, in most societies, and Australia's no exception, that certain arts practices are supported through government funding and others are not. So in a study, quite a recent study in 2019, Diversity Arts Australia noted that the leadership of arts organisations only represented 9% of leaders coming from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. That was even worse in the performing arts, where the leadership was only representing 5% of that group. Another reality, as you would know in the west of Sydney, is that while the west of Sydney has around 50% of the population of Sydney, most of the cultural facilities are in the east part of the city or in the north. So there is a real disparity in terms of provision. Being able to express our culture and through our arts practice, because they're absolutely intertwined, is a basic human right. Arts and culture are always, in a sense, connected because arts are part of the culture that they come from and their work reflects that. Cultural rights are an aspect of human rights. What they mean is that all citizens should have the right to access and participate in the artistic and cultural practices of their choosing. This notion of cultural rights has had a very long history. In fact, it was embedded in the Declaration on Human Rights in 1948. And there's been various conventions passed since by UNESCO to formally ratify more of those rights. However, Australia's was quite slow to join that conversation and sign on to the UNESCO conventions. It only did so in 2009. Further, as many of you would know, Australia is the only Western democracy that doesn't have a bill or charter of rights for its citizens. Nor does it have a treaty with its original inhabitants. The Australian Human Rights Commission has argued that there should be a national Bill of Rights or Charter of Rights that should include cultural rights. In fact, two states, Victoria and Queensland, have introduced a Charter of Rights, and so has the ACT, but the federal government hasn't and doesn't appear to be interested at this point in time. But a democracy is about governments ensuring rights and access to its citizens. They should be treated equally and respected equally. We know that the population of Australia has dramatically changed over the last 40 years, and that the Anglo-Celtic part of that, represented by myself as well, now is no longer the majority. We are still the majority, but over 40% of the population is non-Anglo-Celtic or Indigenous. But most of the funding for the arts and most of the activity is still very much privileged by the Western culture, it was pointed out in this very good study that was done by the Academy of Humanities that Julian is involved with, that in 2019, Australia spent around 0.72% of per capita expenditure on arts and culture. But at the same time, it's also been noted over the last couple of years that Australia is one of the richest countries in the world, according to the World Bank data and according to the OECD data. So the fact that we're spending such a small amount relatively, the average is over 1% in terms of other nations, but we are one of the richest nations. So in fact, we should be spending much more than that. It's quite shameful, I think, that we spend so little. And this is part of the argument in terms of the fact that we are not providing enough money for arts and culture. And so there are arguments all the time about who gets what. But the reality is still that there are some organisations that get much more funding than anybody else. And if you are familiar with what's been happening in arts funding over the past 4 or 5 years, you would know that nearly 100 organisations have lost their funding in Australia. And really, that's a great shame. And we're now in a scenario where we have been forced to close everything. And the arts sector has been the most impacted by that. We had to close first because the arts are, if they're in the performing arts, they're collaborative art forms. And so we had to make sure that people were not in a situation where they would be around other people. So this pandemic has had a dramatic impact on the arts sector. And it really is something that is very distressing in terms of the future, because it is a sector that is already very diminished by the very fact that funding has been so significantly reduced. There is such a disparity in how that funding is shared, and how the current scenario is causing such a crisis in terms of the sector.
Thank you, Jo. I'll ask you, if you don't mind, to wrap up now so I can move on. Thanks.
I think this pandemic should be an opportunity for us all to start to think about how we can do things differently. And I think from all of our points of view, we should say that it's time, using a well-known political mantra, it's time that Australia took arts and culture seriously and took account of the fact that we have a cultural diversity across our nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. And thank you for drawing out that rights-based perspective, but also that international comparison with other countries. We've all been reading about Germany's investment in the arts, the UK's, Canada's, even the United States' investment in the arts during the COVID crisis. And relatively, we're looking pretty poor. I think in Kim Williams' recent op-ed, he pointed out that Australia is currently ranking 26 out of 33 OECD countries in terms of our funding for culture. I think that Jo's intervention is a good pathway to Abdul, who's going to talk about his work in relation to these two big questions. Thank you, Abdul.
There you go. Can you hear me? Oh, fantastic. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for having me to start off. And it was so fantastic to listen to all of you. I really appreciate that. I wanted to come, these questions are really, really massive, and it was difficult to think about coming into it. And I started to think about the role of art and the value of art, and also the impact of art, and to think about the big impacts and the historical impacts to like what's happening these days. And I talk all over the place, so again I apologize for that, but hopefully it's going to make sense as we go. But the idea of, I was thinking of the massive impacts of art, preserving, archiving, documenting and articulating culture since the beginning of culture, and that's been an essential component of human development. And we're in a funny situation now where we have to demonstrate this, or we have to prove this somehow, and it's massively frustrating. Then so often in the political discourse in Australia, they're talking about a national identity or a cultural identity, but so often those who are in politics anyway, talking about Australia's national identity, specifically the national identity being under threat, they're the least willing to put their money where their mouth is when it comes to supporting the people who build on that cultural identity and to build that culture. And I was thinking about other historical examples, like we mentioned Shakespeare before and his contribution to language, but also thinking of something which is like a little bit to the side, I guess, and perhaps regardless of what you think of the contents of it, like the Quran is a 1400-year-old book of poetry that is, pretty definitive for a quarter of the world's population. These types of things are ongoing and they're real, but I wanted to talk more to the personal experience and the impact and the value that art has on those who produce it and those who engage with it. And I wanted to start off quite anecdotally by talking about my first introductions to art and the value that it had to me. And my very first memory of engaging with art is quite a peculiar space. I mean, not peculiar, but it's a work that you might not necessarily expect, in that I grew up in Perth. My mother was a seamstress, and she'd go into the city, this is when I was very little in the 80s and early 90s, going into Perth, she's a short little Malay lady with a scarf, and she'd often feel very insecure or unsafe in a lot of the public spaces there. But one of the spaces that she felt particularly safe in, and every time we go to the city for her to go to Lincraft to get her sewing materials, she'd take me to the Art Gallery WA, and I just sort of follow her along there. And the work that stands out, and with the work that I was so drawn to initially, was a massive multi-panel work by Juan Abdullah, Australian painter from Chile, I believe. And it's not necessarily a painting that my mother wanted me to linger in front of, because there's violent imagery and that sort of thing. But just that introduction at that young age, and maybe being 5 years old or even 4 years old, of what art could be. These are the conversations that could be had. Maybe I wasn't thinking about it that specifically at that point, but the idea of what was possible. And it wasn't just strictly very nice paintings on the wall. And I'm talking particularly from a visual arts perspective, but it wasn't what the rest of the gallery was necessarily. But you could come to this, which was so contemporary and so invigorating, and there was so much going on. It really opened me up very early to what that type of creative pursuit could come to. And as I've grown as an artist, one of the things that I like to do is reach out. I do a lot of community outreach, and I worked in juvenile justice facilities and in outreach programs, especially in high schools. And I'm particularly interested in engaging with high school age children, and to sort of not articulate's the wrong word, but to provide an example, which, without claiming it to be anybody else's experience, but to provide an example of a story that is relatable from their perspective. I know that when I was growing up, there wasn't anyone that looked like me or had names like mine on Home and Away or any of the TV shows that I was watching in popular media and in that popular imagination. So I've found that visual arts has given me a platform to articulate some of these ideas. And often when I'm in these settings, I talk about the ABCs of self-determination, which is so much of my motivation: the autonomy, belongingness, and competence. And there's something so spiritually enriching when you're working with a group of kids that are disaffected in some way, drawing a picture or coming to some type of creative pursuit and coming to terms with the fact that what they're producing is entirely theirs, and they have complete agency over that production of whatever it is. And they have that sense of belongingness by belonging to a community of other practitioners. They have that sense of competence as they grow in strength and their capacities grow, and the more they learn, and they have the autonomy, they have that independence, or that what they create is entirely theirs and can be unique or otherwise, but it can build on something else. But it's that idea of real personal growth, and I find that always so enriching. And it's hard to put any type of number on the value that it has to a community. And even outside of visual arts, when I was young, I worked as a sound tech at a youth theatre company, and the way that built on those ABCs of self-determination, the way that those young people would come together and relate to each other, and in particular in that experience, and also actually across the board with visual arts, with all type of arts, I've found is populated by misfits. And when I talk about being an outsider amongst outsiders, I talk about being a misfit in the Muslim community. But even like going in art school, I worked at a boxing gym. I was too boxing for art school, but I was too art school for the boxing gym. So that idea of finding a place for myself and finding other like-minded people who are thinking differently to perhaps the communities I've come from or wherever, to be able to come together, pull resources. And by resources, I don't necessarily mean financial resources, but the resources of ideas and conversations, and really build on those and grow as people and feel a strength where you otherwise wouldn't. That I can't stress enough that sense of belonging and that sense of finding a community and finding communities of misfits. And this doesn't have to be just for practitioners, but for people who are engaging in work. Like I'm on the advisory panel at the MCA, and one of the real strengths of the institution is their engagement with young people coming into the space who might not otherwise feel any priority should be given to like that type of creative practice, but coming to there and finding something that belongs to them. That's another thing which is sort of, as again I bounce around with these ideas, I like speaking to like I was out in Western Sydney speaking to a group of high school children, and they were talking about being on a school trip and going to the Art Gallery New South Wales, but as they approached the building, it looked like a courthouse, and there was that different experience with that, and they felt that this was a space that didn't belong to them, and they didn't feel any ownership, and that wasn't theirs. But once they were in there and they had a really good tour guide, one of the curators took them through, and the particular students that I was talking to were of Lebanese descent, and then they went into the space, and there was Hussein Valamanesh's work, which he's a Persian artist, but just using Arabic text, and for them that was a key. That was just a tiny door for them to walk through, and for them to see something which they related to and understood, and that was enough for them to feel ownership over the space and understanding that this belongs to them, that cultural space belongs to them as much as it belongs to anyone else, and those histories are their histories as well. And to kind of go off on all sorts of different tangents, like my oldest uncle, his name is Iskandar Zulkarnain, which is a translation of Alexander the Great, and I was curious to why one of my Malay uncles was named after Alexander the Great, and it was only through speaking with that family and understanding how those, like even those Greek histories and that Greek culture, how it went east as well, how it went through Egypt, how it went through the Middle East, and all these sorts of things, how they permeate and how they exist as well, to use memes. They become these ideas that have a genealogy, and they continue to expand and to be built upon. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but like that idea of how that type of value of art and how it can be so nourishing to like the way that people engage, the way people think, and it can be, and not necessarily always like a safe space, the idea of being challenged by art, the idea of challenging perceptions and being forced to rethink things that you've got embedded in you, and how that can lead you in different pathways. I don't know how long I've been talking. I'm sorry.
Abdul, that's fantastic, and don't worry about the directions it went in. I think it was fantastic for all of us to think about the different layers that you went through in your presentation. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Anne.
I'm really conscious that we want to engage our participants very soon. So I'm just going to come back at each of you with one pretty quick fire question related to the work that you do and the backgrounds you come from. So if you wouldn't mind giving a response in around 5 minutes, then we can move to question and answers from our eagerly awaiting participants in the audience. So Tom, I'm going to start with you again. Look, even advertising this event on our Facebook page has generated so much kind of political back and forth. People saying, you know, why the hell should we fund artists? I like to watch race car driving. Why don't we fund race car drivers to do the same? And regardless of the detailed arguments about what kind of funding support goes to what kind of sectors and industries, I wanted to get a sense from you. I'll get your view on this bigger question around whether arts and culture is just for lefties. Is it political? Is it that black and white? And what is it about Australian culture or the Australian psyche that stops us from coming together more through the arts in the way we can come together through sport, for example? I think you need.
How clever is that? Unmuted, self-unmuted. it's one of those questions, again, that only arises with the arts. If you have COVID-19 by some evil chance, you don't ask about the politics of the, you don't say, oh, most doctors are libs, so I don't want to be treated by them. It's an irrelevance in that the arts are often seen as radical because they are both primitive and advanced at the same time. The impulse, there is an impulse of upsetting the apple cart, and it's on that basis that they're seen as leftist. Another reason why they're seen as leftist wrongly is that they concentrate on a government issue. Let me pull a book that obviously influenced South Africa, or a couple of books. The books of Nadine Gordimer, the books of Brighton Breitenbach, the poet, and Ellen Payton's Cry the Beloved Country. They do what good literature always does. They bring a massive policy down to the scale of two old men or two middle-aged men in a railway carriage. And it is within their discourse that the absurdity of policy is revealed. And so in all these people, the depiction of apartheid through all these books ultimately made apartheid, spoke to that part of the South African imagination and the world's imagination, which made apartheid untenable. So it is because there is a tendency in the arts to depict the outsider as a noble creature with a completely coherent cosmology of his own. It's that the world thinks of as leftist. I mean, the conservatism in the last 30 years has very successfully made compassion leftist. It's even made latte coffee leftist. It's made Chardonnay leftist. It's made as human, as our foreign minister Downer, when he was foreign minister, said to a UN commissioner, our immigration policy is very popular. And she, Mary Robinson, said to him, but human rights has nothing to do with what's popular and what's right wing and what's left wing. But the discourse of the last 30 years has made anything at all which embraces the position of the disinherited and the disadvantaged, therefore of its nature leftist. Anyone who's interested in Aboriginal dispossession, as Aboriginals are, and there are great writers now, Ellen Van Neerven and Jonathan Birch, who are writing in their own wonderful, subtle way about that, and also a knockout Aboriginal poet named Ackerman, who, oh God, I've forgotten her first name, but Cobby is one of her forenames. Cobby Ackerman, Ellie Cobby Ackerman, a woman from the west of South Australia. She is a great poet, and she makes policy untenable just by writing in human terms about it. And that's what the arts do. They question policy of their nature all the way along. But as Julian said, it sometimes takes a generation before everyone agrees with them. And so were they right? Yes, they were right all along. Were they left wing? No, they just disagreed with me. And that's what the arts are for, to open up a dimension on policy that people have never thought about. And is the Australian opera left wing? I You can't tell. It transcends politics. And therefore, the idea that we're all thinkers. Now, the truth is, we're all disturbers of the peace. But if we're on the side of the angels, then who cares?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. Julian, I've got a question next for you. You know, the Australia Institute recently released a report on the economic contribution of the arts sector, and there's been a lot of talk about that, and I know this is something that you focus on. But why is making the economic argument for the value of the arts insufficient to help governments and maybe some Australian taxpayers understand why the arts are an important investment in our society? And what has COVID-19 exposed about the place of arts in our society and culture?
Right. Well, I wrote lots of notes about this, but I'm just going to try and wing it because it's a big question. And I feel it'll be written on my tombstone because I trained as a political economist before I went into the theatre. And as a consequence, at a certain point in my life, things that I thought I had repressed forever returned into it as objects of examination. And you can go into any bookshop now, any decent bookshop, and you will see, even in the sort of bestseller section, any number of books on economics. So there's Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, there's Mariana Mazzucato's The Value of Everything, there's John Quiggins' Economics in 2 lessons, and that's just the start. And I would say for anybody in the arts, make them the next book you read, make one of them the next book you read. Because in terms of the methodologies that are used in economics, you're being had. And there are 3 things in a methodological demonstration of value that you need. And I actually was thinking about them when Joe and Abdul were talking, because I think in a way, Joe made the case for what sociologists would call the structural view, and Abdul would make the case for the agent view. And if you put those 2 things together, you have a very compelling case for why the arts and culture are important. And so in a way, we're not putting them together. And the question is why? And the demonstration, the methodologies is supposed to bring them together. And to do that, they've got to be coherent, effective, and to some extent politically neutral. And methodologies can be one of those things, but not the other 2, or 2, but not the 3rd. And the more you look into the recent history of economics, the more you realize it's skewed. It's politically skewed. In terms of the arts, it's also in major ways methodologically incoherent. And it also comes, and this is really possibly the most important point, at what John Quiggin would call a huge social opportunity cost. So it means that every time we talk about the arts in economic terms, we are not talking about them in other terms. We're not talking about them politically, we're not talking about them socially, we're not talking about them morally. And as a result, the discourse around them reduces just down to dollars and cents. And that's a really, really big mistake, because as Joe said, every artistic practice only takes its meaning from a cultural life. So unless you can link those 2 things up, then of course somebody's going to come in and say, well, you know, why don't we kind of subsidize kind of the Grand Prix or whatever it is, which we used to do, by the way, and still do. You know, everyone's got their preference for what they happen to like. But things look very different if you can see that the arts and culture actually inform a common life, the things that we care and share about in common. And I just want to go back to that point and say that at a time of fragmenting politics and increasing sort of social difference, we've got to be very, very careful when we let go of anything that could provide us with anything like a collective ground.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Julian. That's a really good point. And it ties in with what Tom was saying earlier as well, I think. Joe, you talked earlier about inequalities in the context of a rights framework. And I wanted to ask you, do you think part of the challenge of building some unified advocacy for the arts across the arts community, up and down and left and right, is a perception of that inequality in terms of how attention and resources are allocated within the sector?
Thank you, Leanne. It is complicated because there's always kind of an element of divide and rule within the arts sector, because there isn't enough money. And the way that money is distributed, of course, is very out of kilter, in the sense that a few organisations have most of the money. I think that in the present scenario, though, we're experiencing a situation where even the major organisations are in serious trouble. So it's a very unusual scenario. The only way I think all of us who work in the arts or who care about the arts can go forward is uniting in terms of our approach. As Tom and Julian have mentioned, in terms of the arts, what I find always interesting is the language around that the conservatives think that people in the arts are lefty sort of rat bags, and people on the left side of politics often think that arts people are very elitist. So that arts people never seem to fit into a nice sort of space. However, artists are very serious people, really. They work incredibly hard at what they do. It isn't a hobby, as has been mentioned earlier. It's a practice, and it's something that is extremely important for our society. We're an unbelievably fortunate country, not apart from the fact that we're obviously very wealthy relatively. We also are the home of the longest continuous culture in the world. I mean, that is extraordinary. It is something to be celebrated at every moment. We are so lucky here in Australia. And on top of that, we've got such a diverse mix of population. And we know that there's so much richness that can come from that diversity. So it is really important for us all that we value and acknowledge all of those aspects of culture that link into the arts and makes the arts and all the different practices of the arts so important, so pleasurable, so provocative, and so critical to our beings. We know, in fact, that arts practice has always been part of the human condition, and we have to value that and always acknowledge that's what it is. It is essential, and not get distracted by economic arguments that are reductionist and silly in relation to something that is so important, so valuable to our spirit and to our soul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo. Abdul, I have this last follow-on question for you that I hope relates to some of your practice. Why do you think the arts are such a good tool or mechanism or channel for provoking critical thinking? And what can the arts do that other forms of communication can't?
I think with the arts, like, say, like to bring it to my work and the way that I explain it, I did a talk to a high school group yesterday over Zoom about semiotics and semiology and the idea of embedding an artwork with a series of symbols, and if each symbol represented a word, the word might, and you put that word in a sentence, the sentence structure might not make sense, but you'd get an overall picture of something. And I like the nuance that that creative practices can really dig into. I like that there can be some ambiguity with the message, like it's not always straightforward. It comes from different directions, and it's I guess specifically it's a non-linear way of thinking. So you can engage with something in a way that you wouldn't otherwise if it was just simply explained to you, like not just as an educational tool, but a way to really engage with yourself. You can be forced to look at yourself and reflect, but you can engage with the politics of it, and people find it in the same way that Tom was talking about before. It be like there are conservative people who are threatened by that because it does challenge that status quo. and it by its very nature, it's innovative, it's exploratory, and it's gonna speak truth to power so often. Like my mentors, I guess, in Australia are a collective of Aboriginal artists from Queensland called Proper Now, with Richard Bell and Megan Cope and Tony Albert and Gordon Hookey and Laurie Nelson, and the way that they've engaged the politics of today with their visual art practice is so challenging for so many people, but it's so fascinating, so interesting, and so rich with this history that it helps you understand an experience that might not necessarily be the one that you've come to the conversation with. So yeah, the fact that art has this like wonderful capacity to explore ideas in ways that you wouldn't explore them otherwise, I think that's why it's so dangerous and so exciting.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you. So we're going to open it up now and let everybody come on in. I just wanted to say something to our participants or our attendees, as you described on my screen, about how we're going to do it. So most of you would be aware there's a Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen, and we've got some fantastic questions and comments coming in through there now. We've got about half an hour left, so we were also really happy to have some live questions. So if any of our attendees and participants want to ask a question live, I'd ask you to raise your hand, and one of my colleagues will identify a couple of those hands and invite you to ask your question live. But to get the ball rolling for our panelists, I see a question that's come in, a really interesting question from Rob Kennedy. It's really about this tension between whether the arts should be state supported or not. And Rob says, as we do not have progressive governments in Australia, we should never expect the arts to be funded in proportion to the number or the quality of artists and art groups. He says, I think art groups should get together and form a collective to research philanthropic avenues to help support and grow the arts. We need a stronger and more active arts advocacy group, something like Arts Access Australia, but much pushier about supporting the arts. So I wanted to put that to any panelists who want to take that question on in the context of maybe why in Australia's unique situation is state support so important given the relatively low levels of philanthropic funding we have compared to some other countries around the world. Who'd like to take this one up? Julian?
So I'll just unmute myself. I don't know if I can take all of it, but I'm going to take a little bit of it. And I appreciate, it's a beautiful comment about new forms of association, which I think are really important. But I want to come back to a particular policy event that I think has some big impact in Australia. And it's perhaps Gough Whitlam's greatest failure in the arts, which is the IAC Assistance to the Performing Arts Commission that happened in 1976. He set it up. It was delivered under the Fraser government, and it's a dog's breakfast. And it was the first, one of the first post-Whitlam policy documents to really try and get to grips with what the arts represented. And pages and pages of it are devoted to trying to draw a totally false distinction between education and culture. And if you have a country that is as diverse as Australia is, and is perhaps both the oldest culture on the planet, but also in terms of white settlement, one of the newest, and it's trying to integrate all of those into a kind of coherent national identity and some way of getting along as a collective body, then the arts are quite obviously going to have an educational component. I mean, everything that Abdul has been saying, everything that Joe and Tom has been saying has pointed to the fact that this is a very serious mode of self-understanding. And if you see arts and education as allied in that way, then all of these arguments about the government and government support are kind of beside the point, because nobody suggests that, kind of education be something that we just express in terms of personal preference. We know that people have to be educated in order to participate in a democracy. It is exactly the same with arts and culture, full stop.
Would anyone else like to, yep, Joe, you want to say something on that?
another facet of this argument or discussion is that if you just rely on the private sector for art support, then you are also going to ensure that a whole lot of arts activity doesn't happen. If, for instance, you're just relying on, say, a rich individual to support arts practice, that person will want to have some influence and control over what arts practice occurs. And that is quite a problem in a diverse society. So it is really, I think, part of the big conversation that the arts are seen as a responsibility of the whole of society, and that government has a responsibility in that transaction. Of course, it's true that governments can, even with an arm's length sort of model that we have at the moment in Australia, to some extent, have influence over what occurs. But the principle is set up so that there is essentially not a day-to-day political engagement with who gets what. If you don't have that distancing, then the arts can be a tool of government, can be used in a very nefarious way. So I think it's really, really important that governments are involved in arts support as part of their community responsibility. We're a society, we're not an economy.
Thanks, Jo. Abdul.
I wanted to talk in terms of like, and it's only from personal experience, the idea of, from visual arts, like if we didn't have state funding, we wouldn't have public institutions. If we didn't have public institutions and relied entirely on like commercial galleries or philanthropic support, we remove access to huge swathes of the community. And if they don't have access and there's no sort of pathways for them to participate in that conversation and no sense of ownership, our public institutions have public collections, and those public collections are community owned. So yeah, that sense of ownership over those creative conversations, I think, is essential for everybody. And to make it just private, you're cutting off most of the people.
Yeah, so that's about inclusiveness. Tom, did you want to add anything on this particular question, or I'll go to the next one after you?
Just that I think there are various people in the private sector who could handle the sophistication of that. And I think a private arts alliance built up by, whose process was to hit up the people in our community, inevitably mainly Eastern European, who understand the equation of funding, of being a patron of the arts, would not be an absolutely futile business at all, at least for sectors of the arts. There are now even established artists rendered hard up by this, by what has happened. And I don't think it's entirely lacking in merit, what our friend suggested, Mr. Keneally.
Thank you, Tom. I just wanted to let the panel know that we have someone who has a hand up and would like to ask you a question. So I'll now invite David Rowe to ask his question directly to you. David?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Sorry, thanks for the talk. I actually, that must have been an accident. But I will ask a question specifically about Western Sydney, if I could, given that we're at the Whitlam Institute. Jo was involved in a project that I was involved with a few years ago, looking specifically at Western Sydney and the, if you like, the lives of arts and cultural practitioners in the greater Western Sydney region. And I know there was discussion of the accusation of elitism and so on in the arts. But what about also a kind of regional hierarchy or an urban hierarchy. And I wondered what you thought about that side of democracy, a kind of spatial and social democracy associated with art and culture.
Who'd like to take a first shot at that one?
I will.
Tom.
Yes, it's funny, the practitioners, it is true that the gatekeepers of culture and the high priests of culture may come from posher suburbs because they've had the opportunity to pursue their passion, but the practitioners, the creators of the raw product, in my experience, come from the most unlikely places, and they're kids like Abdul who have seen, whose lives have been altered by a vision in a huge painting, but they don't see themselves as the artists because artists come from posh. You know, with any luck, he'll be posh by the time he's finished. But to begin with, many of us come from the most marginal areas of life in the city and the bush. And therefore, there is perhaps we adopt airs if we become successful. I haven't been successful enough to adopt airs yet, but I hope to later. But it is remarkable that there is a huge democracy in the way talent emerges. And part of the emergence of talent is a sense of marginalization. People will be attracted to the arts specifically because it is the fullest way they can express their own marginalization. Now, I can't go into that proposition and I can't prove it here, but I think that a sense of being in some way marginal to the great process of arts is, and marginal in a socio-economic sense, it is part of the emergence of art, whether it's the graphic arts or whether it's literature and the literature and drama. Sorry, I shall retire from the field.
Thanks for that, Tom. Who else would like to respond on this one? Joe?
Thank you, and thanks, David, for that question. It's certainly true that we sort of have an association with artists as living in the sort of trendy suburbs such as Glebe or Balmain in Sydney. But the reality is that most arts people don't make much money, and they can't afford to live in a city. Despite Richard Florida's thesis, most arts people live in areas that are affordable, and the west of Sydney is much more affordable. So there are many people working far away from the urban centres. But I think there's also a difference between people who make art and people who consume art. And so some of the consumers of art can be very wealthy people, and their world and value is very different to those who make art. So I think there's there are interesting differences there between how the arts are framed. Thanks.
Would anyone else like to respond on this, or should I? Abdul, would you like to respond, or shall I move to another question?
Oh no, I'll respond just quickly. And I can understand it, like even coming from a West Australian perspective, even though that's an urban centre, you feel like you're very much isolated from the conversation that's happening in the rest of the country. But I think those doorways are opening up, and it's not even necessarily just a difference between where the art is produced and who's making it and then who consumes it, but also where it's platformed and having spaces and access to those spaces and getting audiences in. I think there's a real challenge, especially if you're coming from outside of the urban centers. But like Joe was saying, so many of the artists that I know, like none of us are from the center, and none of us are, or the center, I mean, like those urban centers, we're all sort of spread out and working and practicing wherever we can be.
Julian, did you have anything on this one?
I'm unmuted now, aren't I? Yeah. Look, just two little historical observations. So when I'm not up the crack of some economics book, I'm usually, in the archives. And there are two stories that probably Joe knows quite well. I think between broader ideas of culture on the one hand and sort of practice on the other, there are policy programs, things that try and get other things done or connect those two things up. There's one story that I'm quite familiar with, which is the decline of the regional theatre companies. So there were a large number of regional theatre companies that developed in the post-Whitlam period in the kind of late 70s. That movement really didn't survive into the Howard years. And in one sense, you can look back and you can kind of go, well, they've been replaced by other things. But quite frankly, I doubt it. So it was an initiative, it was well supported, it had a lot of activism in the region itself, it was quite extensive, and it was a program that really for policy reasons rather than for practice reasons just was let to wither on the vine. So I think there are some skeletons in the closet and some sins on the family soul.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'll go to a question now that's come in on the Q&A from Justine Shee-Pearson. Justine asks, well, she says, I'm taken by Julian's point that the arts are valuable to society because they put forward hard ideas and arguments that make up a substantial part of our intellectual life. But Justine says she wonders whether our politicians and our society more broadly care about the country having an intellectual life. Any views on that?
Julian? Sorry, are you asking to speak, Julian?
I will, Tom, but I will wait for you, please.
Purely because of my years, thank you. Yeah, I think, sorry, now I've forgotten the question. Having exercised politeness?
It was about whether our politicians and our society care about the country having an intellectual life.
Indeed. I think that it's better for right-wing politics in particular, pre-fascist politics in particular, let's call it, not to have too bright an intellectual life. It is better to divide people from each other by depicting groups as underminers of stability or underminers of prosperity than to actually explain the complex machinery of state and the complex machinery of economics. And so I think there is an interest in not having a debate. I think we've seen this in the Murdoch press, where terms such as latte sipper are used as an argument, not only an insult, but an argument that's supposed to stand on its own and dismiss the ideas being put up by alternative people. And so, yes, it is simpler to rule people who don't have a cultural life. And I hesitated saying that because it sounds elitist in Australia, but it's so obvious. It is the truth. It is merely stating a fact. And this is another reason why the arts are dispensable.
Julian?
All right. Well, I've given this some thought. I think I might have a slightly different view, Tom. I actually think if I was locked in a room with one of the ministers from the coalition government, I would try and persuade him that it is, and I have to use the personal pronoun male, I'd probably try to persuade them that, that it's not in their interests to have an intellectually inert population. And in fact, I think you can find on the conservative side that there has been some attempt to provide Australia with some kind of signal light in that direction. And just recently, I was looking at the now much forgotten John Howard preamble to the Constitution that he tried to put into the Constitution in 1999. And I was comparing it to the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart. And I wanted to understand what the differences were. And I was particularly intrigued by the fact that they both involved artists. In the one case, Les Murray, the poet, and in the other case, it literally is an artwork, because the Anagu creation stories form part of the kind of petition. And you can find some significant differences between those two documents, but you can also find some really interesting similarities. One of which is that they both mention culture. And so I wonder, whether this is a conversation, if you like, a marriage that has just gone wrong. That there is a broader conversation here that we need to have as a country, as a nation, without which it is actually not possible to relate arts and culture in any kind of meaningful way. And that conversation is one that is desired on the coalition side, but they don't know how to have it. And perhaps on the other side, we think we know exactly how to have it, but possibly we need to provide a different kind of space for it. So that's the kind of the stuff up, rather than the kind of conspiracy theory of how we get into a more proper frame of mind.
And indeed, might I say, Julian, that the Whitlam revolution did have precursor in John Gorton, who was in his way a very forward-thinking man. And the end of book censorship came with Don Chipp, at that time Conservative Minister for Culture. So there is there is not just one side of politics we can speak to. We can speak to both sides. I was just thinking about the pre-fascist romp of the coalition.
No, totally. But I don't say this easily, by the way. It's a view that I've come to with great personal difficulty. That we just have to speak to anyone who will talk to us.
Any other responses from other panelists on this question before I move to the next? Joe?
I just wonder if there is also an opportunity here that we need to think about how we could change our narrative in terms of making arguments. We've been using arguments based on economic grounds for several years that, as Julian has pointed out, are pretty meaningless anyway. And I think that perhaps it's time as an arts community that we need to develop a way of communicating that has a broader appeal in terms of who it reaches and how it reaches them. We do tend to, at times, because of the fact that many arts people are quite poor, get into a victim kind of mentality. And I think we have to get through that and find a way where we can talk proudly and strongly about what we do, and make communication to people who seem to come in from a very different polarity.
Thanks, Joe. Abdul?
I wanted to come in with something a little bit different, and it's more anecdotal stuff, I guess. And I guess expressing some of the frustrations that to secure arts funding, we have to deal with politicians at all, which is very, very annoying. Like recently, I've had an experience with perhaps the most neoconservative of the current government, with George Christensen, who took offence at some work that I had exhibited up in Mackay in North Queensland, to the point where the works were removed from the gallery, and there was the entire exhibition was threatened for the rest of the tour. And then he managed to get, without coming to me for any type of explanation on the work. He went to Sky News and to Channel 9 and that sort of thing, and it all got a little bit out of control, with threats being made to the gallery and threats being made to the staff over a misinterpretation of the intention of a work, but being so challenged by it that they had to get on the media and then use it as an example of why the arts funding should be cut. But then on the other side of things, just as another couple of anecdotes of frustrations dealing with politicians, I remember interviewing Mark Dreyfus on a radio show I used to do, who was at the time the shadow arts minister, and he was for the Labor Party. But we were talking about arts funding in the upcoming election, and then I asked him why Labor was still supporting offshore detention, and it was like a good 10 seconds of the most awkward radio silence I've ever had, and that other type of frustrating thing where there wasn't an explanation that could be given. And then the final one, I remember being at the NGV in Melbourne. I don't know how many years ago now, but it was while Tony Abbott was Prime Minister. And I remember wandering around and seeing Malcolm Turnbull just by himself, just looking at stuff. And he's on the other side of politics to me, I believe, but I was watching him and thinking, oh, how wonderful is it that in Australia we can have the Deputy Prime Minister at the time wander around a public institution without security guards or a team of security around him. And I thought, oh, that's really fantastic. And I know that he's a big supporter of the arts, but when he was Prime Minister, I don't know what his legacy will be for arts funding in this country. So I just wanted to throw in a couple of short stories. I don't know if that answers anything, but yeah, politicians really annoy me.
Thank you all for the feedback on that question. I'm going to take you now to one from Wilhelmina Warren, who said, and I'm not sure at which point this came in, but she's saying, perhaps a place where we need to reinvent in this particular time and space, is to make a strategic joint effort towards advocating for new models of economics, especially those that include measures for health and well-being. Do any of you think that in terms of what you were saying, Joe, and what we've been talking about in terms of a new narrative, whether shifting a direction that would support the arts through a new discussion about economic models is a way forward for the arts?
I don't support making an argument on economic grounds for the arts, because I think it is the arts are not about economics. We've had this thing for 30 years now where all of the what we might call the KPIs are based on how many people go, how much money's made, and so on and so forth. These are, in my view, not the issue in terms of why you have the arts, but it's a way of reducing what's important. The same thing, though, of course, has happened across health and education in exactly the same way. And instead of looking at why you have health facilities and why you have educational facilities, everything's been turned into a kind of business model. I was told very seriously that I had a misunderstanding about the purpose of a university several years ago, where I was told it was a business. It is not an educational institution. And I think the same applies to hospitals. They're seen as businesses, first and foremost. This is nuts. I mean, they're there as a community facility, and if they're not there, as we're witnessing it through the pandemic, then there's a problem, a huge problem. This is why we pay taxes. These things are very, very critical to our survival as a people. And I think universities are now in serious trouble because they've been so focused on making money. You can argue that they've been also underfunded by governments for several years, but to rely on making money from international students is not a very balanced model, I think.
All right. Did anyone else want to comment on that, on new models of economics? If not, I'll move to, I think we have a hand up from Mary Travers. I think we'll try and unmute Mary now. She seems to be there. Mary, would you like to ask your question or make your comment to the panel? Mary, do you hear us? We don't hear you yet. Oh, okay. That was accidental. In that case, I'm going to go to a question from Kate Crawford. Kate says, if participation in the arts supports self-understanding, then surely public support for the arts might be part of public responsibility for inclusion and democratic participation by everyone. Do any of you think that that's a good framing? Abdul, did you want to say something on that?
Oh, no, not specifically, apart from that. Yeah, I think it's hard to push on an entire society that they have an obligation to the arts, but it's something that I personally feel. Yeah, that's all I've got to say on it, really.
Okay, thanks.
Can I say something on this one, Leah? Yeah, I feel it too, Abdul, but I don't feel it personally. I feel it functionally. And I think the response to Mr. Christensen is, if you don't want to see this in the galleries, then you will see it in your streets. So there has to be some way in which we can address these questions in a space in which we can all converse about them. And closing things down just isn't going to solve anything. It's just going to make us more divided, more angry, more disaffected. So it really is, I think, apart from anything else, apart from being objectionable and really kind of silly, it's also self-defeating for the whole political spectrum and not just for one part of it.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question now. So I thought I might take you all to one from Jane Gilmore. Jane says, Kim Williams wrote about the unwavering march of general ignorance, and it seems to her that the arts have become caught up in this fundamental downgrading of knowledge and understanding within our society. She asks if Julian and others could comment on this, please. Do you want to? Okay. Jo, would you like to go?
Sure. Certainly, I think that the example that Abdul gave about George Christensen responding to his work is an example of where one person has too much of an influence over what is actually happening. And if that person's opinion is rather skewed, then it is really damaging. We're living in an age where our leaders are advocating ignorance, advocating attitudes and prejudices and responses that are based on attitudes around racism, around being elitist, all sorts of things that are really negative traits. Under the Nazis, a lot of art was prevented from happening because it was seen as too disruptive and too provocative. It shouldn't be about being comfortable, really, I think. It should be about making provocations. And I think that to say and to dismiss somebody's ideas because it's different to your own in such a public space, in such a public way that he illustrated is extremely sad that the community would react and support that occurring. So I think that's one of the things we all have to deal with at the moment in a way that is quite challenging, is that it isn't a bad thing to be educated. It isn't a bad thing to care about things and to value things. And it isn't a bad thing to really try and communicate ideas that are complicated or beautiful or whatever.
Mm. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll have a go at this one. This is quite large. You can try and follow the technical debate through economics, through microeconomics in particular. And what you see is that the notion of knowledge and understanding gets smaller and smaller, more and more reduced, stripped of its kind of moral dimension, and turned into a sort of mathematicized idea of information. And I just keep coming back to economics, because I think in some ways it's an enabling discipline of this onward march of ignorance. It's not that the economic concepts per se are dumb and make people dumb. It's just that the narrative behind them is really, really not a good one. And because economics has had such a sway on public policy making in all sorts of areas, it has instituted that its dumb idea of knowledge into government and into the public domain through government. So we have to come to terms with that. We're not the only one standing at this awful bus queue. Ahead of us, as Joe said, is education, and before that is the environment. Unless we can find a way of, say, realizing the problems that we are having relating to our natural world, unless we can institute that and bring that into our social and economic conversation, then there's going to be nothing, either arts or culture or anything else. But we're in the same, on the same part of the street, looking for a more expanded understanding of our citizenship, so that we can have the life that we hope for, and the life that we hope for others as well, not just for ourselves, which is what a genuinely functioning democracy is about.
Look, thank you to people who submitted those questions. We've only got about 8 minutes to go. And what I'd like to do before we do disappear and people start dropping away is think about, it's so valuable to have these conversations, and we're so lucky to have these perspectives. But where do we go from here? How do we take this conversation forward in a way that can have some potential impact? So I'd like to invite John Della Bosca, who's Associate Director at the Whitlam Institute now, given his experience as a New South Wales minister, a politician and a policy maker, as well as his background in the arts with the Opera House Trust and the Council of Sydney Symphony, to talk us through any thoughts he has on how we might change the narrative. How do we take forward both a unified and a unifying message that can advocate for policy solutions for better funding for the arts? So, John, if you can join the conversation, would you like to come in for 5 minutes before I wrap up?
Surely, Anne. Thank you very much. And I wanted to just add what I'm sure everybody else has been on this webinar. Thanks to the panelists, it's been a very informative and fascinating time. In fact, it's gone so quickly. I'm kind of surprised how much the time has gone. But look, I'll just be fairly quick, because just I'm, as Abdul would say, one of the dreaded politicians, or at least I'm X one, I suppose, a fair way X now. So, look, I think one of the things I think is important to focus on when looking for a way forward is, what is to make the solutions kind of reflect the problem, and so I go for a couple of simple ways through. And the other thing is that at the Whitlam Institute, we spend a lot of time thinking about the policy legacy of the Whitlam program, the original Whitlam program, and use that sometimes a bit of a guide to dealing with the contemporary policy problems that we face. And I think one of the key characteristics of E.G. Whitlam's policy agenda on the arts was the notion, and it's clear from Kim Williams's paper, that the idea that the distributive decisions around arts policy are made by artists where possible, and not by political patronage or political bureaucracy, and that the funding levels that are attributed to arts should reflect the inherent value and purpose of the arts. And that gives us a few points to look for a way forward. The key policy objective, in my view, is that we need to find and advocate for a form of governance and a funding mechanism that values artists and art for their own sake. So we can, as I think a number of panelists have made the point repeatedly, that while we can usefully recognise the contribution the arts make to the economy, it's not in itself a sufficient reason, or even a good reason, to support the arts. There's a whole lot of other good reasons to support the arts that are better reasons. And though the economic value of the arts is self-evident, arts policy has to recognise the power of the arts to represent and develop the national sense of purpose. That's something I think that was very strong in the Whitlam program. It even, in a sense, the modest kind of advances that the Menzies government made, sort of to be a bit bipartisan about it, were reflected on the basis that there was a national sense of purpose, a national character being evolved, and simply that some things about the arts just add to the sum of human joy, and that they're important for that reason and that reason alone. But the policy framework around the arts and cultural industries, I think, has got to produce an arm's length decision-making process, free from party political intervention and even direct ministerial intervention, and the judgments about discretionary funding should be made by artists and not politicians or bureaucrats, even though there's a lot of good politicians and a lot of good bureaucrats. There should be, I think, a funding separation between the funding of production and the funding of infrastructure. So there really is a kind of tendency, which wasn't really canvassed today, but oftentimes people in government say, well, we spend a lot of money on XYZ opera house or XYZ theatre, but the rest of the arts are, starving in the street. So there needs to be a clear distinction between funding infrastructure for the arts and funding the arts themselves. And last but not least, what is the kind of solution? Well, I think at least the direction we should be pushing is for something that the creation of a pool of funds that goes beyond budget cycles, and if you like, it's similar to the Future Fund, an arts future fund, with governance and revenue principles similar to the Future Fund, which, as far as is possible, remove funding and infrastructure decisions away from direct ministerial control and put the real decisions more in the hands of the Board of Governors in a way that the Australia Council was originally meant to function. In other words, artists making decisions about the funding and distribution of the arts. I think that's kind of the direction I think that we need to start advocating for, and it's nothing new, and it's nothing that hasn't come out of today's discussion. It's nothing that wasn't kicking around as a policy position in the 60s and 70s, but I think it's even become more relevant since the George Brandis Night of the Long Knives, and also I think in addition, in this COVID climate where artists simply aren't being valued, not being supported like most other people in the economy are, I think really underlines the things we need to change.
Thanks so much, Don. I think that was a really good pulling together. And I just wanted to let everybody know we've really appreciated your questions and your comments. And what we'll try and do as a follow-on step from here is produce a short discussion paper that summarises some of the conversation and some of your feedback. So you'll be able to find that on our website. But first of all, in wrapping up, let me just say a huge thank you to our wonderful panellists. Your contributions have been astounding and really, really a wonderful contribution to this discussion. So thank you to Abdullah, to Joe Caust, to Julian Meyrick, and to Tom Keneally for being our panel. Thank you too to all of you who joined us. We've really had 2 hours is a long time for a Zoom meeting, and we've kept a lot of you with us, so we're really thrilled that you could stay for the conversation. If you wanted to review it, or if you know people who would have liked the conversation but couldn't join us at this point in time, we fingers crossed, inshallah, we actually have a recording of this video that will also be on our website. So please share it as widely as you can if you think other people would like to be part of this conversation as we move it forward. Those videos, those wonderful interview videos are also up there, so I encourage you to look at those too, as well as, of course, Kim's fantastic legacy paper that's been referred to so many times throughout the conversation. So thank you again, and thank you for helping us get through our first webinar with some level of success. We appreciate your participation, and we look forward to engaging with you again further. So take care, everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.